Welcome to Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. In today's episode, we examine one of the most unsettling questions in modern society. Who really owns the media? For decades, people have believed that a free and independent press acts as a check on power. But what if nearly everything we read, watch, or hear is shaped by just a few massive corporations? Tonight, we follow the trail of 6 powerful companies said to influence the flow of information and the way we see the world. The idea that a small group of corporations could control the vast majority of global media might seem like an exaggeration. But the roots of this theory are grounded in a slow and deliberate transformation that began over 100 years ago. In the early 20th century, newspapers were the dominant form of mass communication. Thousands of independently owned publications flourished across cities and towns, offering a diverse range of viewpoints. Ownership was local, and editorial decisions were made by people who often lived in the communities they served. That began to change as radio and then television emerged, requiring more capital and infrastructure than most small publishers could afford. This shift made media more centralized and ripe for consolidation. By the mid-20th century, a handful of powerful families and corporations began to dominate the airwaves. Names like Hearst, Murdoch, and Sarnoff became synonymous with influence and information. The Federal Communications Commission, established in the year 1934, was tasked with regulating broadcast media in the United States, but its decisions often favored larger corporations over independent outlets. Deregulation intensified this trend. In 1987, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcasters to present opposing viewpoints, removed a key safeguard against bias. Just under a decade later, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 opened the floodgates. The law, signed with bipartisan support, was presented as a modernization effort. In reality, it paved the way for massive mergers and acquisitions. Within 10 years, hundreds of media companies were absorbed into fewer than 10 conglomerates. Local stations were bought by national syndicates. Newspapers lost ground to online platforms controlled by the same entities that owned television networks. The diversity of voices that once characterized American media narrowed. By the early 2000s, reports began to surface warning that just 6 companies controlled over 90% of what Americans saw, heard, or read. This raised critical questions about editorial independence, access to information, and the ability of the public to make informed decisions. Culturally, this period also marked the rise of what some call infotainment. News programming shifted away from investigative journalism towards sensational coverage and celebrity scandals. The line between news and entertainment blurred. Critics argued that this was not accidental. The consolidation of ownership meant fewer decision-makers behind the scenes, often with financial or political interests that did not align with public transparency. The result was a media landscape that looked free on the surface, but operated within increasingly narrow bounds behind closed doors. Understanding how we arrived at this point requires looking beyond individual headlines and examining the structural forces that redefined the flow of information. In a world where media ownership is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, questions about objectivity, influence, and manipulation become unavoidable. By the early 2000s, a clear pattern had emerged. 6 major corporations had risen to dominate the American media landscape. These were Comcast, the Walt Disney Company, Time Warner, Viacom, CBS Corporation, and News Corporation. Each of these entities owned an extensive network of television channels, movie studios, publishing houses, and digital platforms. Together, they controlled not only what was broadcast into homes, but also what was printed in newspapers and pushed through internet news portals. To understand how this level of dominance was achieved, it is essential to examine the key players behind these companies and the strategic moves that expanded their influence. Comcast, once known primarily as a cable provider, became a media powerhouse after acquiring NBC Universal in the year 2011. This deal gave Comcast control over the NBC broadcast network, Universal Pictures, and several cable channels including CNBC, MSNBC, and Bravo. It also expanded Comcast's reach into film, news, and entertainment, all under a single corporate umbrella. The Walt Disney Company followed a similar path. Originally built on animated films and family-friendly programming, Disney grew into a global media titan through aggressive acquisitions. It purchased ABC and ESPN in the mid-1990s, giving it one of the largest television broadcasting platforms in the world. Later, it acquired Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and most of 21st Century Fox, bringing with it hundreds of film franchises, television shows, and international news outlets. By the year 2019, Disney had become one of the most powerful entertainment conglomerates on Earth. Time Warner, now known as Warner Bros. Discovery, shaped much of modern television and film. Its holdings included CNN, HBO, Warner Bros. Pictures, and Cartoon Network. Though Time Warner faced several restructurings and mergers, including a highly publicized deal with AT&T in the late 2010s, its media assets remained central to shaping public discourse. Viacom and CBS, once a single company, were split in two and later remerged into Viacom-CBS, now known as Paramount Global. This entity controls CBS News, Showtime, MTV, Nickelodeon, and Paramount Pictures. Its influence over both entertainment and journalism is extensive, reaching millions of viewers across multiple platforms. News Corporation, founded by Rupert Murdoch, is perhaps the most controversial. Through Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Post, it wields immense influence over conservative political discourse. Internationally, it owns media outlets in Australia, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, shaping narratives across continents. Each of these corporations is publicly traded, with boards composed of elite executives, bankers, and former politicians. Critics argue that such concentration of ownership not only limits the diversity of opinions, but also creates potential conflicts of interest between corporate profit motives and journalistic integrity. When a handful of companies control the flow of news and entertainment, the boundary between information and influence becomes difficult to define. These six media giants have become gatekeepers of perception, shaping not only what the public sees, but how they see it. Supporters of the media consolidation model argue that large corporations bring efficiency, consistency, and resources to an increasingly complex information landscape. But critics have long pointed to a series of core claims that underlie the conspiracy theory suggesting something far more calculated is at play. At the center of this theory is the idea that when so few entities control nearly all major media, they do not simply influence the news. They engineer consent, guide public behavior, and protect corporate or political interests through omission, repetition, and narrative control. One of the most widely circulated pieces of evidence comes from a 2012 graphic that has since gone viral across alternative media sites. It visually maps out the 6 major media companies and the dozens of subsidiaries they own, including radio stations, book publishers, newspapers, music labels, and film studios. The graphic is often used to illustrate how an overwhelming amount of content consumed daily traces back to a tiny group of boardrooms. It is not uncommon for 2 competing networks to be owned by the same parent company, creating the illusion of choice while offering nearly identical coverage. Another key claim involves the homogenization of headlines and talking points. Over the years, viral compilations have emerged showing local television anchors across the country delivering the exact same script on the same day, often word for word. In some cases, dozens of newscasters repeat the same phrase, prompting concerns that editorial direction is not being determined at the station level, but pushed from centralized sources. These incidents have sparked debates about how much autonomy local newsrooms actually have, and whether they are serving as conduits for corporate narratives rather than independent journalism. Documents and whistleblowers have added fuel to the fire. In leaked emails and internal memos, there have been references to pre-approved topics, suppressed stories, and directives on language framing. While news organizations claim such guidelines are meant to maintain journalistic standards, critics argue that they serve to quietly steer public perception and maintain the illusion of neutrality. The editorial process, once thought to be a rigorous check on accuracy and balance, is seen by some as a mechanism for filtering out inconvenient truths. The financial interests of parent companies, also raise questions. When a media outlet reports on an industry in which its parent company is invested, skeptics question whether true objectivity is possible. For example, a corporation that owns both a pharmaceutical subsidiary and a news network may be less inclined to air stories that question drug safety or regulatory failures. Similarly, defense contractors with ties to media companies may shape the tone of war coverage or political analysis. Perhaps the most concerning claim is not about what is shown, but what is not. Critics argue that systemic media ownership creates an echo chamber where certain stories never surface at all. By controlling which topics are even considered newsworthy, the corporate gatekeepers determine the boundaries of public discourse. Events, scandals, or viewpoints that threaten powerful interests may be buried under a flood of distraction, entertainment, or less consequential headlines. This form of silent censorship, they argue, is far more effective than overt propaganda. It creates a reality where the public believes they are informed, while key truths remain hidden in plain sight. To understand how such claims hold weight, we must examine the actual mechanisms through which editorial control and message uniformity are implemented. This includes the process by which stories are approved, language is standardized, and dissent is managed. At the corporate level, content decisions often begin not with journalists or producers, but with executives and legal teams who assess potential liability, brand alignment, and shareholder risk. This top-down influence can determine not only whether a story is published, but how it is framed, who is interviewed, and what facts are emphasized or downplayed. Take, for example, the phenomenon of newswires. Major outlets frequently rely on centralized sources like the Associated Press or Reuters to provide base reporting. This shared reliance means dozens of newspapers and websites may publish nearly identical stories, written by a small pool of journalists and edited at speed. Although these organizations maintain strict editorial standards, critics argue that this structure invites homogeneity, where the same facts, quotes, and interpretations echo across platforms. When these wire services are also subject to the same corporate pressures as the media companies they serve, it becomes difficult to trace where neutrality ends and influence begins. Another mechanism involves advertising. Corporate media outlets are financially dependent on advertisers, many of whom are among the largest multinational companies in the world. These sponsors are not passive participants. They often exert pressure over programming by threatening to pull funding if certain topics are covered or if certain language is used. In some documented cases, investigative stories into oil companies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, or tech giants were reportedly altered or canceled after sponsors objected. This gives advertisers a de facto editorial role, especially in a profit-driven model where commercial survival depends on appeasing powerful partners. Hiring practices also play a role. Editors, anchors, and reporters who challenge official narratives or pursue stories that conflict with corporate interests may find themselves reassigned, silenced, or removed. High-profile examples exist of journalists resigning or being fired after exposing internal censorship. In other cases, ambitious professionals simply learn to self-censor, understanding which topics are off-limits if they wish to advance. This silent compliance reinforces the perception that only certain viewpoints are acceptable within mainstream discourse. Standardized language guidelines are another point of concern. Leaked internal documents from major networks have revealed lists of approved terms, suggested headlines, and framing instructions. These are not simply grammar notes. They are tools used to shape public interpretation. For instance, referring to foreign leaders as authoritarian but never using that term for Western allies, or using phrases like conspiracy theorist to discredit whistleblowers or independent investigators. Over time, these editorial choices create a language of authority that reinforces institutional credibility while marginalizing dissent. In this environment, the boundaries of acceptable thought are drawn not through force, but through subtle control of tone, timing, and terminology. Whether intentional or systemic, the result is a media landscape that appears diverse on the surface, but is deeply aligned beneath. For those who question the official story, the uniformity of message across platforms is not seen as consensus. It is seen as coordination. While proponents of the media consolidation theory point to centralization, repetition, and editorial control as signs of manipulation, skeptics argue that these patterns can be explained by simpler, less sinister forces. From their perspective, the similarities across media outlets are not evidence of conspiracy, but rather of efficiency, market demand, and the structure of modern journalism. They argue that corporate ownership does not automatically equate to malicious control, and that journalistic standards remain largely intact despite economic pressures. One of the most common counterpoints is the logistical nature of news production. When a major event occurs, such as a natural disaster or political development, the facts available at the time are often limited to official sources. Reporters across different outlets receive the same press releases, attend the same briefings, and interview the same public figures. As a result, similar stories emerge not because of top-down scripting, but because the available data points are the same. Skeptics argue that this is a natural outcome of centralized information flow, not evidence of coordinated messaging. Another key rebuttal is the economic reality of modern media. Outlets rely on advertising revenue and viewership to survive in a highly competitive market. Stories are selected based on their potential to attract attention, not necessarily to push an agenda. In this view, sensationalism, celebrity gossip, and shallow political commentary dominate because that is what generates the highest engagement. Critics of the conspiracy narrative argue that what appears to be manipulation is often just a response to consumer behavior and market forces. Regarding the influence of advertisers, defenders of mainstream media claim that safeguards are in place to protect editorial independence. While it is true that advertisers hold financial power, major outlets typically maintain internal walls between the business and editorial departments. Journalistic ethics codes, ombudsmen, and independent review boards are cited as tools that prevent undue influence. Mistakes or ethical breaches, they argue, are exceptions, not indications of systemic corruption. On the matter of message repetition, skeptics reference Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is often the correct one. When news anchors read similar scripts or share identical phrases, it is often because they are using syndicated content, following industry templates, or complying with legal language requirements. These uniformities may seem suspicious to outsiders, but are often part of normal media operations. Lastly, some critics of the conspiracy theory point to the rise of independent journalism, podcasts, and social media as evidence that no single group controls public discourse. With millions of creators publishing content daily, they argue, the idea of a total information lockdown becomes implausible. According to this view, if corporate media were truly suppressing key truths, the internet would expose them instantly. And in many cases, it does. These alternative viewpoints do not dismiss concerns about media ownership, but they suggest that the system may be flawed in familiar ways, not necessarily conspiratorial ones. Bias, commercialism, and political influence are real issues, but they may stem from structural limitations and economic incentives rather than a deliberate agenda. For some, this distinction is critical. For others, it is the very denial of such coordination that keeps the system intact. Regardless of where one stands on the question of coordinated control, the broader implications of concentrated media ownership are difficult to ignore. When a small number of corporations control the bulk of the information ecosystem, it affects more than just what stories are told. It shapes how people think, how they vote, what they fear, and even how they define truth. The issue is no longer just about potential censorship or bias, but about the psychological and cultural power that comes with owning the narrative. At its core, the media is not simply a business. It is a tool of mass influence. The stories people consume form the foundation of their worldview. They determine what problems appear urgent, what voices are seen as credible, and what solutions are considered acceptable. When those stories are filtered through just a few corporate frameworks, it becomes possible to influence public consciousness on a scale that was unimaginable in earlier centuries. For example, during election cycles, the framing of candidates, the selection of debate moderators, and the emphasis on certain issues over others can significantly shape public perception. Studies have shown that repeated exposure to specific phrases or images can create emotional associations, reinforcing ideological divides or promoting certain values. This is sometimes referred to as agenda setting, a process where media does not tell people what to think, but rather what to think about. When that agenda is guided by a handful of corporations, the implications for democracy and independent thought become profound. Beyond politics, cultural norms and social values are also molded by media. Trends in fashion, health, relationships, and identity are often introduced through entertainment programming or advertising partnerships. Documentaries, sitcoms, reality shows, and film franchises carry implicit messages about morality, status, and success. Even the depiction of villains and heroes, of truth and deception, follows patterns that reflect deeper ideological narratives. Critics argue that these narratives are not neutral. They reflect the interests of those who fund and produce them, often aligned with consumerism, nationalism, or specific political philosophies. Children are especially vulnerable. With media consumption beginning at increasingly younger ages, the formative influence of television, music, games, and streaming content shapes their understanding of the world before they develop critical thinking skills. Educational programming, branded messaging, and character-driven merchandise create an immersive environment where ideas are embedded as entertainment. The result is a media-driven culture where belief systems are subtly engineered rather than freely chosen. Critics of corporate media ownership warn that when dissenting ideas are consistently marginalized, and when language is standardized across platforms, the boundaries of imagination itself can be constrained. What people view as possible, acceptable, or real is narrowed by the repetition of dominant narratives. In this context, the concern is not just about misinformation or censorship. It is about the creation of a shared mental environment that reflects the interests of a small elite. Whether intentional or not, this structure allows for unprecedented influence over thought, emotion, and behavior, a soft form of control that requires no force, only repetition. The long-term societal impact of concentrated media control becomes even more visible when examining shifts in public trust, the polarization of discourse, and the transformation of journalism itself. Over the past 2 decades, public confidence in traditional media has declined sharply. Surveys conducted in the early 2000s showed relatively high levels of trust in mainstream news organizations. But by the mid-2010s, that trust had fractured along political, generational, and cultural lines. Some blamed this erosion on partisan bias, others on sensationalism, but many pointed to something deeper: the growing awareness that the media may no longer serve the public, but rather serve itself. At the same time, the role of the journalist has changed. Once imagined as an independent watchdog holding power to account, the modern journalist often operates within a corporate framework, bound by editorial policies, ratings pressures, and digital algorithms. Investigative journalism, which is time-consuming and expensive, has been gradually replaced by fast-paced content production designed to generate clicks and ad revenue. Reporters are encouraged to produce multiple stories per day, often sourced from trending social media or press releases, leaving little time for original research or fact-checking. This shift is not accidental. It reflects a deeper alignment between media companies and the economic models that sustain them. News stories that challenge corporate power, expose systemic abuse, or question foundational narratives tend to be high risk and low reward in a business sense. They attract controversy, legal threats, and advertiser backlash. Meanwhile, stories about celebrity scandals, political rivalries, or lifestyle trends generate safe, reliable engagement. As a result, even without overt censorship, difficult truths may be quietly deprioritized or reframed to fit within safe parameters. Social media platforms have added another layer to this evolution. Algorithms prioritize engagement over accuracy, rewarding emotionally charged content that confirms pre-existing beliefs. Media outlets, in turn, tailor their stories to fit this model, leading to more reactive and polarized content. This creates a feedback loop where public opinion is shaped not by careful reporting, but by the speed and virality of information, regardless of context or credibility. Concentrated media ownership also affects how crises are covered. When a disaster strikes or a scandal breaks, media companies can determine how long the story remains in the spotlight, which experts are invited to comment, and which interpretations are presented as legitimate. In some cases, entire narratives are constructed or collapsed based on internal decisions about tone, priority, and framing. Critics argue that this gives corporate media the power not just to report on events, but to manufacture reality itself. Moreover, these effects are not limited to national borders. Many of the dominant media conglomerates operate globally, exporting their content, values, and narratives to other countries. Through film, television, and online platforms, Western media norms have become embedded in the cultural landscapes of nations around the world. While some view this as a form of soft diplomacy or global connectivity, others see it as a subtle form of imperialism, where economic and ideological influence spreads under the guise of entertainment and information. Ultimately, the influence of media is not confined to what it says, but in what it normalizes. Over time, a population repeatedly exposed to the same ideas, the same values, and the same voices begins to adopt those frameworks as their own. The boundaries of debate narrow, the scope of acceptable thought contracts, and the mechanisms of consent become internalized. When media functions more as a mirror of corporate interest than a reflection of public life, its power extends far beyond headlines. It reshapes the cultural DNA of society itself. Outside the boundaries of mainstream analysis, more speculative and fringe interpretations of media ownership have taken hold in online communities, alternative forums, and independent publications. These perspectives go beyond corporate consolidation and explore the possibility that media control is part of a larger, hidden agenda, one designed not only to influence public opinion, but to engineer global consciousness through a system of symbolic manipulation and psychological conditioning. Some researchers in this space argue that media conglomerates are not just business entities, but instruments of a deeper structure, often referred to as the shadow elite, the deep state, or the invisible hand. In this view, the media functions as a modern priesthood, guiding belief systems, shaping values, and enforcing a collective worldview through repetition, symbolism, and ritual. Entertainment, news, advertising, and even children's programming are believed to contain embedded messages, crafted to condition the subconscious mind. One of the most common elements of this theory is the idea of predictive programming. This concept suggests that films, television shows, and news stories sometimes portray future events not as coincidence or imagination, but as a method of psychological preparation. According to this interpretation, major world events, such as terrorist attacks, pandemics, or technological breakthroughs, are occasionally depicted in media long before they happen in real life. Believers argue that this is done to create a sense of familiarity and acceptance, so that when the real event occurs, the public is already emotionally and cognitively aligned with the official narrative. Symbols play a central role in this framework. According to symbolic theorists, the recurring use of specific imagery, such as all-seeing eyes, pyramids, checkerboard patterns, or ritual hand gestures, reflects a hidden language used by elite networks within the media. These symbols, they argue, are not random or aesthetic, but are part of an ancient tradition rooted in secret societies and esoteric belief systems. Their presence in music videos, fashion campaigns, film posters, and live broadcasts is seen as a signature, a signal to those in the know, and a subtle form of mass initiation for the general population. Another layer of this theory involves the emotional and energetic influence of media. Some fringe thinkers propose that fear-based reporting, violent imagery, and emotionally charged content are used intentionally to lower public consciousness and generate collective stress. This state of emotional volatility is believed to make people more suggestible, more reactive, and easier to control. In this sense, the media becomes not just a conveyor of information, but a tool of energetic manipulation, one that affects the psychological and spiritual health of entire populations. Other variations of this theory propose that certain media events, particularly those involving mass tragedy or celebrity deaths, are orchestrated rituals designed to harness emotional energy for unknown purposes. These interpretations often tie into broader conspiracies involving bloodlines, occult practices, or extraterrestrial influence. While there is little mainstream evidence to support such claims, their persistence in underground communities suggests a deep cultural hunger to explain the otherwise inexplicable. Whether one accepts these fringe theories or not, their existence points to a growing distrust in official narratives and a widening search for hidden meaning. In a world where information is abundant but truth feels elusive, the rise of symbolic interpretation and speculative frameworks reflects more than just paranoia. It reflects a spiritual crisis rooted in the loss of trust. For those who believe the media is not merely biased, but intentionally deceptive, uncovering the symbols and decoding the messages becomes an act of resistance, and for some, a path to liberation. The question of who really owns the media is not a simple one. On the surface, it can be answered with corporate names, stock market data, and public filings. 6 major corporations with vast portfolios spanning news, entertainment, publishing, and streaming hold the keys to what much of the world sees and hears each day. That fact alone has sparked concern, debate, and investigation. But beneath the numbers lies something deeper. A conversation not just about ownership, but about power, perception, and the nature of reality in a media-saturated world. For some, the explanation remains grounded in economics. Media consolidation, they argue, is a result of technological change, global markets, and the pressures of survival in a competitive industry. For others, the story is more insidious, a deliberate narrowing of the human experience, orchestrated by unseen hands with goals that transcend profit. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Even without intent, the end result may still be the same: a population informed through a lens crafted by a small elite whose decisions ripple through every screen, speaker, and signal. The consequences of this structure are both visible and invisible. On one level, we see the homogenization of headlines, the erosion of investigative journalism, and the rise of infotainment in place of substance. On another level, we sense the effects in our language, our fears, and our collective attention. We see it in the stories that are amplified, and in those that vanish overnight. We feel it in the narratives that shape our identities, in the values that become normalized, and in the questions we are taught not to ask. And perhaps most striking of all is how invisible this control can be. When media functions as a mirror, people often forget to question who is polishing the glass. When stories arrive prepackaged, with voices and visuals aligned across platforms, the illusion of choice becomes a powerful form of control. What is absent, what is repeated, what is exaggerated, and what is silenced, all of these shape the public mind as surely as the words themselves. Ultimately, whether one believes in deliberate coordination or unintended consequence, the outcome is remarkably similar. A concentrated media landscape limits the range of perspectives, defines the terms of public discourse, and influences what billions of people consider to be truth. This raises questions not only about journalism, but about freedom, awareness, and the future of communication in an age where reality is increasingly constructed through screens. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show and unlock bonus content, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.